GM, welcome to Web3 Academy, your one trusted source to capitalize on the next big phase of the internet. Don't get caught in the hype cycle. I'm Jay Bird, and I believe that distributed governance is going to change the world. That's why I'm carving a path for doers to confidently build and invest in Web3. On today's show, we have with us Zenobia, the SVP of Communications for Hedera, a leading Layer 1 blockchain that is focused on the enterprise sector. Now, Zenobia talks about how it's not just enterprise that's building on Hedera. As I said, they're a leading chain that has a lot of projects on their chain. However, Hedera has approached governance in a very interesting way. They haven't gone and said, we're going to do fully decentralized governance. And there's some decentralized maxis that would shout and scream about their setup, but they have done a form of distributed governance by getting 30 organizations, leading organizations around the world, universities, research organizations, and businesses, brought them all together and said, you are going to govern the Hedera chain and the Hedera network. And that's a very interesting, what I would say is a middle approach to not being centralized, where it's just one organization making all the decisions, but also not being completely decentralized, where you get into challenges of who is making the decisions, how active are they? You have to worry about voter apathy and engagement. And so there's this middle ground that they have achieved that's very interesting. Hedera also has started to really focus on some incredible use cases within blockchain, within Web3, and we break those down. We talk about tokenization of real-world assets, and Zenobia gives us some great examples of some projects that are doing that. And we also talk about how blockchain can be used to ensure accountability of organizations in terms of their environmental impact. It is such a problem that we face in the world right now is climate change, one of the biggest problems that is not discussed enough, in my view. And we need corporations to not only say that they are going to do things in order to reduce their carbon footprint and help improve our climate and our world, because so many organizations are saying that, but we need to know that they're actually doing that. And Zenobia talks about how blockchain and a public ledger can be used to achieve that accountability, which is just an incredible use case for blockchain that we need more businesses to be taking on. Great episode. Zenobia's experience is so vast. She started her career in tech, working at Intel. She then worked for Ben Horowitz and Marc Andreessen. She actually worked directly under Marc for a period. And she starts off today's episode by giving some insights into what it was like to work with a leader like that who just saw things so differently. She's been part of a sale of a public company which sold for over $1 billion. She started off her education at Stanford, and then she's been in Web3 for over 5 years on the Hedera team, building out Hedera and the Layer 1 ecosystem that they're focused on. So just an incredible background that brings a wealth of knowledge that really sees things from the 30,000-foot view, understands how important it is to really explain Web3 and explain blockchain in a way that everybody can understand, and how she is aiming to do that at Hedera and throughout the entire ecosystem. So without further ado, enjoy today's episode with Zenobia, VP from Hedera. Before we jump in, let's just hear a word from our sponsors. Modern newsletters are built on Paragraph. That's right. Paragraph is a brand new newsletter platform that combines the best parts of Web 2 and Web 3 to supercharge newsletters for both writers and readers. Build a community, not just an audience. Paragraph uses blockchain tech to allow readers to collect and own the words that matter to them. This takes reading a newsletter to the next level. With Paragraph, readers can mint, collect, and show off quotes from their favorite newsletters. This opens new possibilities like creators sharing revenue with fans. I also love their new feature, Paragraph AI. This integrates GPT-4 natively in Paragraph to create, edit, and improve your writing effortlessly with one click. And guess what? We at Web3 Academy are on board and have already moved our content over to Paragraph. We believe this is the future of newsletters because of the profound engagement it creates between creators and fans. So, whether you're a creator, writer, or an avid reader, it's time to check out Paragraph and capitalize on the opportunity of being early. Zenobia, welcome to Web3 Academy. So excited to have you here today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Let's start, before we jump into your incredible work experience, your career experience, everything you've built. You've been in Web3 for a long time, longer than most of us have. Before we get into all that, your TED Talk, I want to start with your experience working with Marc Andreessen. You talked briefly before we hit record about working with him and the lessons you learned. I think we all know A16Z or A16Z, as you would say in the US. I'm Canadian, so my Zs are Zs. You seem to learn a lot from him, and he's such an incredible leader and well-known person, not just in crypto and Web3, but really in global economy. What was it like working with him? Tell us a little bit about that story.
Absolutely. So I worked for Marc Andreessen and Ben Horowitz when they were at their previous company, which was LabCloud, and then became Opsware. And for a period of time, my direct boss, who was the head of marketing, went out on maternity leave. And they just decided that, set aside the fact that Marc said he never wanted to manage anyone and he didn't like it, and he was very loudly going to tell everyone that, they decided that he would actually manage the marketing team while she was on maternity leave. So it was actually a lot of fun. Marc just has such a different way of thinking about things, and I think he helps others do that as well. So a great example was, we were talking about naming a product, and he said, well, let's think about sushi. And everyone sort of says, well, what are you talking about? And he said, well, it's sushi. Like, how much more likely are you to buy sushi than you are to buy cold, dead fish? Those two are the same thing. But the marketing and the branding of something is really important. One other thing that he was not afraid to do, and I think still is not afraid to do, is to make mistakes and to make them quickly. He would say, let's make different mistakes, right? Let's not make the same mistakes twice. Let's go try and make different mistakes. And I think that as an organization and as a marketing team, that gives you the ability to try a lot of different things and recognize that not all of them will work. But as long as you are continuing to move forward from that, you are going to get better. You are going to innovate. You are going to do things that some people might criticize, but, in the long run will turn out good if you are not afraid to continue to make different mistakes.
That is such a valuable lesson, especially in a nascent space like blockchain and crypto, where everything is under a microscope. We're such a small community right now. And I have a bit of a bone to pick with crypto Twitter, I find often, because every time a new project launches, everybody loves to just come down on it and to point out everything that's wrong with it. I don't want to open up the WorldCoin debate or the Twitter X debate right now, but those are two. I mean, Twitter X is not Web3 yet, although it seems to be going in that direction with Twitter coins. But there's all these changes, and there's these leaders that have the fortitude to make tough decisions and to try things and to experiment. And I think we should be celebrating that, not ridiculing them and pointing out every mistake you made, because you're going to make mistakes. You need to make mistakes when there's new tech and you're trying out all these new things. You have to experiment. So I love
Absolutely.
that.
Well, and I think, the other thing that we don't do enough in this industry is sort of consider the wisdom of our elders, right? And think about the mistakes that have been made in the past and try to not repeat them. Because a lot of times you see people repeating the same mistakes that were made in Web 1 and Web 2. The number of people who, if you talk about Twitter vitriol, said, this marketing team is terrible because they have not agreed to buy the naming rights on a sports stadium. We saw that playbook in Web 1. We saw that on the billboards that, went up along 101 that drove no ROI. Thinking that you have created the next great idea when you don't actually take those lessons of the past, I think can be equally harmful.
It's so true. Okay, so speaking about the past, for our audience, give us the rundown of, the sort of the elevator, the 30-second view of Zenobia's career, what you started with, and kind of bring us up to where you're at today and what you're focused on now.
Sure, absolutely. So I started my career in finance for Intel. I pretty quickly learned that it was a great training ground, but I was quite bored. So I was done with all my work by like 2 p.m. every day. And they said, great, you can, rotate into a new role in 18 months. And I was like, I will have gone crazy by then. So I was lucky enough to be in Silicon Valley during, .com boom. I joined a startup called Beyond.com, which, if you can imagine, was one of the first startups to digitally deliver software, right? You didn't have to get floppy disks and install them in your computer. And this was a revolutionary concept. From there, I was recruited to LoudCloud, working with Marc and Ben and that team. We went public. We actually went through the entire .com boom and bust. I think within that single job, we IPO'd, the market tanked. We spun off the services part of that business and focused just on the software, and so became Opsware. We eventually sold that business for over $1 billion to HP. And at that time, I started taking a look at, okay, what do I do next? My then fiance, now husband, was based in Atlanta. And so we thought probably good to live in the same city. So I moved to Atlanta. And at the time, Atlanta was not the tech hub that it is today. Today, we have a great blockchain hub. We have tons of fintech. We have a lot of healthcare tech here. But at that time, it really was not a center for innovation like it is today. And so I did what I would call a sharp left turn in my career. I went back to my roots a little bit in finance, and I went to work as a sell-side analyst covering internet security and infrastructure. Very, very quickly, I remembered why I didn't go into investment.
I was going to say, wow, what a decision.
And I was like, okay, this is maybe not for me. It was a great training ground, right? It was a way to learn. Cybersecurity is a very deep and complicated industry. There's lots of layers to it. And it was a great training ground to learn that and to understand how those markets worked, to sort of, reconfirm my investor relations chops and to just get a better purview of everything happening on that side of the infrastructure world. But after a very short stint there, I left and started a PR agency and IR agency, so focused on investor relations and public relations for companies. We ended up mostly working with companies in the cybersecurity space, which is how I met Dr. Lehman Barrett and Mance Harmon, who are the two co-founders of Hedera. And I started working with them. We started working together many years ago. I feel like I'm going to date myself by giving a long history here. But essentially, we started working together first on Swirlds, which was focused on, private ledger implementations. Once that had been tested and we understood how that technology worked, then we launched Hedera, which is obviously the public layer 1 network that is open source and anyone can build on. And, I think we also do get a lot of questions on the Hedera ecosystem because we are a distributed network and we want to be fairly distributed organizations. Once we had the network up and running, we also went about the process of kind of spinning off the different pieces to make sure that the Hedera Governing Council and Network are really just focused on the governance and the software code base. We then started up the HBAR Foundation and subsequently the Hashgraph Association and the DLT Science Foundation, which are all other separate individual members of the ecosystem that provide grants and support and help grow projects that are developing on the network. And then we spun out Swirlds Labs, which is the marketing and product development support arm. So today I sit within Swirlds Labs, but we, of course, support the entire Hedera ecosystem and its growth.
Very interesting. It's so interesting how Web3 ecosystems or networks are creating in this new way because of open source and this ability to have governance where you can have all these different organizations that are all using the same protocol and have a similar mission and working together. And so I want to touch on that and want to touch on the Hedera ecosystem. But just before we go there, I want to understand you have this background in tech, finance, and PR and marketing. You probably could have gone any direction with your career. What was it about blockchain that really attracted you?
So I think it was a couple things. One, when I worked for Marc and Ben, you realize what sort of a really incredible, dynamic, super smart founding duo can do for a project and a company. And in all my years being on the agency side, I had always said, I'm not going to go back to in-house. I love being on the agency side, never going to do it. And I think probably most people who meet, Dr. Lehman Baird have a similar experience. When you meet him and you start to work with him, you're like, oh, this is mind-blowing, right? Like the way that he thinks about things, the forethought that he has put into this, the way that he has, thought about all those different aspects of it. And then similarly, Mance, on the business side, the way that he has thought about the governance of the network and how that needs to shape out to make sure that you don't sort of have this entropy and you don't have governance that, ends up being run just by a handful of people. Because if you don't purposefully design governance, then that's going to happen. So those two were really the catalyst for me saying, okay, I want to dive into this space more deeply. When I started to explore more of the applications for blockchain, I think that's when I got hooked. So most people today, I think, if you ask them what is blockchain, they say cryptocurrency. And I think that is, for your audio listeners, you won't be able to see this, but that is this small circle, right? It's a small, tiny circle. But the use cases for blockchain, if you open up that aperture, are so much bigger. And there are so many different areas where it can affect our lives. I was pretty infuriated when Equifax had all of my consumer data stolen. And when, somebody filed a fraudulent tax return on my behalf, and, we had to go through all of these steps in terms of validating who we are, setting additional security protocols with the IRS, that should never happen, right? You should never have a company that powerful that owns that much of your data without you having any recourse or way to control that data. So when I thought about what are technologies that can really make a difference in the way that we as individuals can be a little bit more empowered, I jumped right in.
The pain of that. It's so interesting to speak to anybody who's been, I'm going to use the term rugged by Web 2. It's not exactly the perfect term here, but We've had so many guests who have content that they created, whether they had like a large Facebook group or a big Instagram following, and then they were removed from the platform for really no fault of their own, just because the platform decided that they couldn't be there anymore. Or whether in your case, you had your data stolen, which was not your fault. You didn't do anything to have your data stolen. It was the centralized company that got hacked, and then your data's lost. Now it's on you to pick up the pieces and deal with it. Did Equifax support you at all
we're not going to curse on this podcast, but the offer to monitor my credit for a year, thanks a lot. Like that is of no help, right? There was no recourse, no material recourse for them.
Right. Oh my gosh, awful. Well, okay, we're going to dive into how blockchain is going to fix that and what you guys are doing at Hedera in order to get there. If you were to explain Hedera to a non-Web3 person, how would you explain it?
Sure. So I guess, are we going non-Web3 being Web 2, or are we going non-Web3 being like my aunt or uncle who's like, I have no idea what you do?
Yeah, no, non-Web3 being Web 2 just doesn't, it doesn't have a crypto wallet yet, but is tech savvy.
Yeah. So, I think, if you think about where all our data lives and who controls that today, it's not just, the Facebooks and the Equifaxes of the world, right? It's also that infrastructure. How many people use AWS? How many people use Azure? And all of that is very centralized, and there's no granular control for anyone, right? You cross your fingers that, you basically are beholden to their SLAs, you're beholden to their terms of use, and like it or leave it. And I think that blockchain, if you really go back to the essence of crypto, not in the sense of cryptocurrency, but of cryptography, is about delivering cryptographic trust and, building it on an infrastructure in a way that is decentralized so that you don't have to trust any single party. There are a lot of applications where you want that, right? I would love to share data about certain things, perhaps with my entire supply chain, but I don't necessarily want them to know every single piece of that puzzle, or, and I don't necessarily want like the one guy who raises his hand to host all that data. That's valuable data. So, any application where you either have a middleman who gets to control all that data, or you have, a series of people who want to work together, but they don't trust each other 100% to just own all that data for, as a single entity for all those parties. Those are areas where I think blockchain can be of great use for an organization. I think the third area we are really starting to see is, with Web 2, you have had some level of personalization of the customer experience. There's a lot of direct to customer purchases. There's a lot of brands that have popped up to sort of serve that niche. But you've also had a consolidation of customer data among Amazon. I will admit, one of my favorites, Target, right? A lot of those companies, they now hold so much of the consumer's purchasing power. And you as a seller essentially have to say, like, fingers crossed, and I don't necessarily know who is buying my stuff, and I don't necessarily know anything about them. And while I would love to have a better relationship with that customer, I can't, because Amazon controls all of that data. So if you as an organization are able to say, how do I create a direct relationship with my customer? And I make it super simple, right? They don't need to know that blockchain is on the back end, but I can get data from them that they have chosen to share. It can either be specifically to that person, or they can abstract their, parts of their identity that they don't want me to know. But I can get that so that I can serve them better products and services. That's a very different relationship for a company that is trying to get to know their customers better, trying to get insights into what they want and don't want, and try to make their direct relationship a lot stickier.
It's a very simple way to look at blockchain and how it can be used for existing businesses is if you have middlemen that are involved in the data, that's their position, is that they control data, or somehow they are participating in the sale of your product or the management of your supply or your inventory, that with blockchain, you could eliminate that middleman and have direct to consumer, but do so in a private way where, like you said, the consumer doesn't need to give you their data directly. You can use ZK proofs, all these different tech that is being built on blockchain right now. So Hedera is a layer one. They're one of the first layer ones, I believe, like founded, 10 years ago, more even?
2018.
Okay, 2018. But that was, 2018 is only 5-6 years ago, but that's still
30 years in.
That's exactly. So one of the original layer ones, top 30 token by market cap, I believe 1.8 billion market cap. I think I was looking yesterday. I think it's around 30 in market cap. So a leading layer one. What was when you spoke about the two founders and you were on the team early too, why start a layer one? What was the mission that everybody sort of sought out to achieve?
Yeah. So, I think from day one, and the reason that the original company was called Swirlds was because Lehman had this vision for shared worlds, right? You can go online and you can decide who is in your world, and you don't have to live in just one world. You don't have to live in just Facebook's world. You can live in multiple different worlds. You can engage your communities, or, if you are a business, you can engage, you can have your customers in one world, you can have your supply chain in another world, you can have, your finance in a separate world. But the ability to create these shared worlds where each individual participant decides how much they want to share, how they do that, and has a vested interest in that world.
I didn't know that Swirlds was shared worlds. I will say, I think you made a good decision changing the name to Hedera. Maybe you can explain. Hedera is just easier to say and to spell than Swirlds is. I struggle to even say Swirlds.
Yeah, so the underlying consensus algorithm is called the hash graph algorithm. And when we were looking at names, it's sort of like saying, okay, that's a database. You can't really just call it hash graph. So we were thinking of what else goes with H. Hedera is actually a kind of ivy that, when you look at it, forms a very similar structure to what the hash graph algorithm does in terms of how it writes the data and how it connects. So that was the origin of the Hedera name.
Interesting. I love that. I love it when names have meaning like that. Okay, so Hedera, the network, layer one blockchain, built pretty early on amongst layer one blockchain, quite successful layer one blockchain. Before we jump into that blockchain and what its purpose is and how it operates, you briefly mentioned all the pieces. I just want to understand, and I want our listeners to understand the full ecosystem here, because it's not just the network or the chain. There's also the governing council, there's also the token, and you mentioned a few, and there's Swirlds Labs, like you mentioned, all these different players. Can you kind of give us an overview and help us understand how they all work together?
Sure. So you can think of kind of core Hedera as, there is the Hedera network. There is also the Hedera Governing Council, which governs any changes to the code base. It governs the token distribution. It makes technology and business decisions about the network. That governing council is today about 30 of the world's largest enterprises and research institutions, like top-tier universities. And you might say, well, wait a minute, aren't we trying to get away from these big guys all governing us? And if you were to say a single governing council member, yes, you don't necessarily want a single governing council member, governing you. But what you do want is 30 of the largest members who have big brands that they are concerned about and they would not want to do reputational damage to, and each of them having an individual vote, have those spread across industries, have them spread across geographies, have them even spread across the time that they're allowed to serve on the council, so that the voting mechanisms that are put in place ensure that, you can't have one or two people driving the direction of the network. I know a lot of projects will say, hey, that doesn't make sense. Anybody can participate in our governance, so we have more distributed governance. But I think when you look at the actual people, number of people and number of entities participating in governance, Hedera is actually much more distributed. It is not sort of a little cabal of 10 developers who essentially control the code base or the direction of the network.
Yeah, I just want to dive into it because this is very interesting. There's the centralized chains, so let's not talk about them. But this is different than the decentralized chains like the Ethereums, who have a much more distributed governance plan. And it's not to say one is better or worse than the other, because I do agree with what you're saying, that it's very easy to say, well, anybody can vote, but then you look at the actual voting numbers and not everybody is voting. There's really a big actually issue. There was that point, it was like last summer, everybody wanted everything to be a DAO. And it was like, oh, everything should be a DAO. And then everybody realized it was like actually coordinating strangers and internet strangers and getting them all to vote and work together is really hard. And okay, wait, maybe everything shouldn't be a DAO that actually doesn't get anything done. Just get a little bit more into the weeds here. Does this mean that there is literally 30 votes on the council and that each of these organizations has one vote and then can you kind of give us an idea of how that works?
Yeah. So, and I will say, technically it's 29 because there are 29 members of the council right now, but you can think of it as actually, it is not in its legal structure a DAO, but you can think of it as actually a successful, model for a DAO. So, there are certain decisions where you have to have a simple majority of council voting to approve that decision. There are other decisions where you have to have a larger majority or absolutely everyone on the council voting to make that decision. And so, as you can imagine, it is not easy, right? It's not easy to coordinate timeframes across the globe. We have council members on every continent except for Antarctica. It takes a lot more education. It takes a lot more communication. It takes a lot more coordination to explain to people and make sure that they are making thoughtful votes. That's not easy work, but if you really want to design your network to have purposeful decentralization for the long term, you have to do those things, because otherwise you entropy back to the 5 guys who have the strongest opinions.
Mm-hmm. It's so funny that you bring up Antarctica. We had Josh, the head of product at Anchor, on the podcast a few weeks ago, and he said they got an RPC call from Antarctica, and he was like, yo, people are using wallets, crypto wallets in Antarctica. We were so pumped about that.
That's awesome. The final frontier.
We're going global. We were trying to speculate on what that person was probably doing. They were probably on like some trip or something like that, and they were checking their wallet or making a trade. Who knows? Anyways, I want to understand. It was very interesting that Hedera decided to do this governing model. Is that because Hedera's mission is focused on that client base or that consumer of the enterprise businesses of the world, and they knew that involving those people in the governing would give them access to them in terms of the business development side, really? Or was it more so that Hedera saw that these were the thought leaders on blockchain? Can you explain to me what the thought process was there?
Sure. I think it was twofold. One is the governing council model is taken from Visa. So, like I talked about, Mance has always sort of had a vision from the business side, and the Visa network functions very similarly. It is an organization of financial institutions that help govern the Visa network. And obviously, it has been a very successful model that, does billions of transactions at speed and at scale globally. So good one to follow, right? Lots of opinions in terms of what are best governance models, but this one was proven out. The idea for getting the largest organizations there were a few different considerations. One was, they have brands that they want to protect. So they are not going to make bad decisions, for their own self-interest, because those bad decisions would weigh so heavily against their reputational brands. Second was they do have, the capacity, whether that is the expertise or the funding or whatever that might be, to do innovation. So if you look at someone like DLA Piper, who has been on the council from day one, they actually spun off a division called Toco that is focused on asset tokenization. Now, one of the hardest things about asset tokenization for real world assets is not actually the technology, it's the legal frameworks. So very nice to have DLA Piper, one of the leading law firms, be able to work through that multi-year process of how to do this legally in various jurisdictions, right? They have that leadership and they have the ability to do some of those kind of developments that take a long time, but that will drive enterprise adoption. Now, people sometimes say, well, gosh, Hedera is really only for the enterprise. And that's not true. Anyone can build on Hedera. Any application can build on Hedera. We have a ton of startups that are built on Hedera and that we fund, not we, but that the ecosystem funds. But my question back to them is always, have you ever met a startup that does not have great hopes and dreams of being the next big application, that does not want to conquer their category, that does not want to be number one in their space? Because if you do want to be a big, successful organization, you should probably build on infrastructure that is scalable for your ultimate success. I mean, I think we saw this in, again, going back to let's make different mistakes. We saw in Web 1 and Web 2 people building on infrastructure that couldn't scale with them. And so they would have to do a complete product rebuild 5 or 6 years into their journey. And without fail, it stalled their customer adoption, because making that shift takes resources. It takes a huge amount of engineering. There are always things that don't work exactly the same. So if you are planning on being a wildly successful startup, why not think about your infrastructure from day one, assuming that you will require that scalability, that you will require that, cost of goods sold model that's predictable, that you will require all those other things that the largest enterprises require. And so the governing council also serves as a check on, okay, well, would these big companies build on this platform? Is it enterprise grade enough for them?
Let's use that to sort of lead into the chain and the tech. What's unique about the chain? And I don't know if you want to compare it to Ethereum or to Bitcoin, to other layer ones, or however the best way is for you to frame our understanding of the tech behind the chain and how you guys built it and what it aims to do.
Yeah. So I think, and you touched a little bit on sort of layer twos and ZK proofs too. So there's a couple things. One, it is extremely scalable, right? Hedera is doing hundreds, if not thousands of transactions per second. That is something where I think people have started to say, oh, wait, well, I can also add this other thing on to my base layer to make it more scalable. I can also add this other thing on to my base layer to enable privacy. I can add this other thing on to my base layer to enable a fixed, cost when I do transactions. In some ways, if you think about kind of the Mac model versus the PC model, I think we have taken a much more Mac approach, which is, at the end of the day, a business is not going to necessarily try to put together their own Frankenstein stack, right? They are probably going to want all of that. Actually, it turns out you can build it into the layer one, and we have done that. And so why would you say I'm going to, stack on 3 or 4 different technologies that get me the scalability and the security and the cost that Hedera already has in their layer one?
Hmm. Interesting. So what do you think about the recent trend of layer ones? So CeeLo recently said that they're going to, I think they've put forward a proposal. I don't know if the proposal is passed yet, but they are looking to become a layer two on Ethereum. Curious, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think that that is a path that we're going to see other layer ones do? Do you think they'll follow that? What are your thoughts?
I think they will have to catch up, right? Like I said, you don't have, most enterprises don't say, great, I want to work with the most number of technologies to build my stack. They say, I want it to be simple. And ideally, it has all of these attributes to start with. And, the things like privacy that maybe weren't thought of early on, this goes back to my point about, Lehman just thought about these things much earlier in the journey because he too comes from a cybersecurity background. He comes from an enterprise infrastructure background and in terms of thinking about how things have to be scalable for massive, massive systems. So yes, I think to be able to deliver to organizations what they will start to expect in terms of a user experience, you will start to see more of these chains have to kind of puzzle together those pieces, whether they build it, whether they buy it, whether they partner, all TBD. But I think our vision has been, okay, well, we should probably include that all in a simple underlying layer one.
Mm-hmm. Which is why your layer one has been built with speed in mind, with low transaction costs. I'm curious, one of the things that's like so important for the success of these blockchains is obviously a sustainable business model, right? And one of the ways that every blockchain's sustainable business model is really built off of selling block space, right? They continue to sell block space as more people need block space. Thankfully, right now, we have, I would argue, a need for unlimited amount of block space because maybe not in the current bear market, but it's coming. It's coming because there's just not enough, not even close to enough block space built yet. With Hedera being a low fee model, do you think about how to ensure that the business is sustainable long term if it's just low fees? Does that provide enough income for the business to be sustainable?
Yeah, so, like you hit on, that is the way that Hedera generates revenue, right, is through transaction fees every time that somebody makes an API call. But I think you can think about it as, if you were just doing the functions that are available to you on a calculator, you might say, okay, well, I can do, 5 transactions per minute, or I can do a certain number of things and I can do them at a certain scale. Because we were built for scale from day one, we are thinking about, okay, what happens if, today we are doing, I think, a little under 1 billion transactions per month. And that's not the network coming to consensus. That is real world transactions where people are writing to the ledger every one of those transactions. When you get to the scale of, if you're using a computer and you're thinking about all the kinds of functionality that you can then perform with a computer, you are thinking about, billions of transactions then potentially per week or per day. And so that is really, the goal is how do you make this network so usable and so functional that you are driving those transactions and you are therefore driving the revenue from those transactions.
Tell us a little bit about the token HBAR, the tokenomics behind that. Can you give us a brief overview of, I know it's fixed supply. Can you give us some details about that?
Yeah, so it is fixed supply. There are 50 billion HBARs that were minted. There will not be more. Again, that's an example of a decision where we would have to have unanimous votes by every council member to change the supply, right? So when you look at that, you can say, okay, well, what do I think are the chances that every council member would vote for that? We actually have a treasury management report that we publish on the website, and we keep that updated. And so anybody can go and see what is in release supply. Anybody can go and see where those coins have been allocated. And the reason that we did that was, again, we want that high level of transparency in terms of showing to people what has been allocated where and what buckets that is going towards. So HBARs function as the network fuel. You pay in HBARs to make API calls for the various different Hedera services. Those services range from, I think, a fraction of a penny to maybe a penny or, up to 10 cents, depending on sort of the grouping of what you're doing. But the fees are denominated in HBAR, but they are actually calculated in USD. So if you are a business, this is again going back to, how do we make blockchain more accessible for businesses? If you are a business and you are a CFO and your application developer comes to you and says, great, I've built this amazing blockchain-based application and, I'm ready to get customers on it. And he says, great, how much does it cost? And you say, well, today it costs $100 and tomorrow it might cost $2 or it might cost $1,000 to do that transaction. Is that okay? My father is a CFO and he's given me some stern looks in his life, but I know what he would look at me if I asked him that question, right? You are not going to have organizations who say, sure, I can model out an application that I'm going to go build and introduce to my customer base with a wildly variable cost of goods sold.
I know you said that Hedera is not just for enterprise, but it feels like that's where the trust lies, right? Like if there is an enterprise and we all talk about how we want to see more enterprises come on to blockchain, but there's big risk, right? If you're $1 billion company, you have to be very selective with the decisions you make because it doesn't just impact your tech and your products, it also impacts the image of your brand. And right now, let's be honest, the image of crypto and Web3 is not so great on a global scale. So we need organizations like Hedera, ecosystems like Hedera, where it's a little bit easier for an enterprise to say, oh, I work with somebody on that council. I know them. I trust them, right? Oh, Hedera also offers low fee transactions. Oh, I can predict the transaction cost. So I can, as you said, I can go to my CFO with a proposal and a plan that isn't this like, oh, it's going to swing wildly because of the token prices and because of gas is going up and down. So good luck predicting this. Those are key things for enterprises to come onto blockchain. So Hedera is really serving a very important purpose, I would say, within the ecosystem. Sort of giving my view. Is that accurate? Is that how you think about it?
I think you're spot on. And, I do think that in the current environment too, that issue has become more and more important for startups, right? We have seen VC funding over the last year or so dry up pretty dramatically. You are starting to see VCs take much more granular look at a startup's, proposed everything, but specifically proposed financials, right? If I tell you I'm going to get to 1 million customers, first of all, I have to believe that you can get to 1 million customers. Second of all, again, if you tell me that your cost of goods sold getting to 1 million customers might cost you $1 million, it might cost you, $100 million, I might question whether I'm going to fund your business. So, those are things that, yes, of course, they are important to enterprises and they are, crucial to, if you want to be that trust layer of the internet and you want to underpin all of these services that they provide, you have to have. But we're also starting to see startups realize, wait, the people who are backing me are going to have this heightened level of scrutiny. So I better be able to have those answers too.
Yeah, unless you have AI involved now, you're not getting money from VCs. Blockchain doesn't do so good in the pitch deck currently.
And, it's interesting because I do think that, this is going to be the time where you see people create some really interesting businesses that were sort of forged in the fire of this downturn, right? That's when historically you have seen some of the strongest businesses get funded and emerge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, completely. You can go back to the internet bubble and how many of the biggest businesses today were built after that bubble popped. Okay, I want to talk about a few use cases of businesses that are building on Hedera and what they're doing and touch on, because it's some exciting stuff. So you've talked about tokenization of real world assets. And I know that there's some businesses that are tokenizing some real world assets on Hedera. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So I'll go through a couple examples. One that I really love because I think everybody, especially young people, have experienced this in the last few years is a company called Quarter Homes, which is tokenizing home ownership and fractionalizing home ownership. So, you read the stories about how it's gotten wildly expensive to own a home, how the entry point has gotten so high. They have a really innovative model. And, again, they worked with DLA Piper because they said, great, if we're going to actually tokenize real world assets, we need to make sure that this is legal, right? We need to make sure that we have all these frameworks and we have all of this set up. What they do is they offer, you can, purchase a home, you can tokenize that so that you own a percentage of it and investors own a percentage of it. and you equally participate in the upside. So if the home appreciates 100K and you're 50% of the investment and the investor is 50% of the investment, then they equally participate in that upside. But what we're hearing from, especially people who are trying to buy their first home is that's worth it to me, right? It's worth it to me to give up some of the upside in order for me to get a foot in the door. And then over time, I can choose, if I have a windfall or I've saved more, I can choose to essentially, buy back more of that equity before having to sell the house, for example. And so that to me is just a model that I think we've had such a broken model for home ownership in many, many countries. It's kind of core to our society, right? And the roots of our society, and giving that generation that hope and also just that place to live that they call their own and they have that pride in. So I think that is a really interesting one.
I was going to jump in here because it's so interesting how we all know that some of the greatest wealth has been built off of real estate investing. Like everybody knows that generally, right? I don't think you don't need to take an investing course to know that. But so few of us invest in real estate because it's prohibitive because of the cost, right? So there could be no better way to ensure that we all have opportunities to build wealth than to tokenize, fractionalize real estate investing. It is just so obvious, but it's so funny to sit here in my seat because we've talked about a couple of different companies. We had the CEO of Lofty, which is another company that's tokenizing real estate, on the podcast about 6 months ago. Talked about it several times in a roll up. It feels like there's always this news, but for whatever reason, it hasn't caught mass adoption yet, because over here, you have everyone maybe not buying cartoon JPEGs. And that is where all the money is flowing. And I just am like, guys, just go, if you want to invest, if you're in blockchain and you got some ETH or some Bitcoin and you want to do something else with it, I mean, I'd probably just keep it in ETH or Bitcoin if I were you. But if you want to do something else with it, and this isn't investment advice, but I would really look at these tokenized real estate platforms, because that is such a great opportunity to get into an asset class that you previously couldn't get into.
Yeah. And I think it's just also opening up the aperture in terms of people who will then have interest in this, right? There are so many more people. Much as we love the Web3 world, we are a tiny community compared to the number of people who want to buy a house.
Yeah. We almost hit 20 million active wallet addresses last month, by the way. That was a very exciting number to see. That it shows you how small we are. 20 million active wallets. Yeah. There's 4.6 billion active internet users. We are so early. We are so early. Okay. Yeah. Any other tokenization of real world assets?
Yes. So another one is Archax, which I think is really interesting because, this feels like the year that we're starting to see the recognition of, hey, we've got to make Web3 and real world come together in a way that is consumable for not just Web3 users, but we're also seeing this recognition by traditional institutions that, wait, maybe we can take advantage of some of the things that Web3 brings to our existing processes. And so Archax is a really interesting company based out of the UK. They do tokenization of funds. So mutual funds, other kinds of funds, money market funds. They have actually been working on this for a number of years. Again, huge regulatory challenges to work through to make sure that they are regulatory compliant in their, regime and for the customers that they can serve. While they were in the process of developing their product and going through this regulatory compliance, they started having conversations with Aberdeen, who is also a member of the Hedera Governing Council. Aberdeen has been looking for ways to tokenize their funds. So they are working on that. I'm going to set that aside for a minute. But what Archax has done is they have essentially said, typically the narrative around crypto has been, well, should I allocate a portion of my fiat or other asset classes to crypto? Archax almost turns that on its head. They have said, great, you may have crypto that you're not necessarily sure what you're doing with. You may want to park it somewhere. You're not potentially actively trading or doing these other things with it or using it to buy things. They have tokenized a portion of Aberdeen's money market funds. So you can think about, potentially using your crypto to, again, get into an asset class that has whatever the interest rate is today, it has a rate of return, right? So if I don't know what the money market rate is today on Aberdeen's money market fund, but if you've watched interest rates over the last year, it's definitely higher than it was this time last year. So thinking about, again, how do you get a return on your assets by connecting this Web3 with non-Web3 financial investments?
Which again, is sort of similar, we can frame it similar to the real estate tokenization. This is giving opportunities for people who would not usually be able to invest in these type of asset classes. Now you can because of blockchain and crypto. And as you said, a lot of these asset classes, especially Aberdeen, want massive fund, very successful. You wouldn't have been able to invest in something like that before unless you were like a multimillionaire or you had like a big check to give them. But now with tokenization, you can fractionalize and I'm assuming the average consumer can come in and invest. Although maybe there's regulation. I'm not sure what they're allowing on that. This is where the regulation side is so tough to manage. So
yeah, I mean, I think as long as you are an Archex customer. Now, I don't know how big that customer base is, and I'm sure you have to do KYC.
Yeah.
But, that is a great point, right? I think the reason that a lot of people or some people got into the kind of original version of DeFi was to, get yields and get rewards, right? We have seen some of those come down across various ecosystems at the same time that we have seen interest rates go up across the world. So, you can now do the math on where do I want to put my funds, and this gives you flexibility to do that, whether you have been investing in those funds traditionally or whether you're coming from that Web3 perspective.
Yeah, very interesting. I like the way you frame it like that. Okay, I want to move on to ESG and climate change, ESG being environmental, social governance, how we can use blockchain for good. We don't talk enough about this. There's some stories, and we had Climate Down on the podcast who's looking to fractionalize carbon credits and bring those on chain. And so that was a great conversation. And we've spoken to Gitcoin, who's really focused on public goods. For better or for worse, there's just a lot of financial opportunity in crypto and Web3 right now. And so we have a lot of greed, but there is so much good that blockchain can be used for. Can you tell us about any projects that are operating on Hedera and how you are seeing businesses use blockchain for good?
Absolutely. So I think there's the broader blockchain for good, which I feel like I could talk about all day, right? There are things like Project Starling, which are trying to capture records and images in war-torn regions and make sure that those are documented and, they live on across multiple blockchains, including Hedera, but importantly across multiple blockchains so that there is a record when, you have to go at The Hague in front of the International War Crimes Tribunal in 30 years and demonstrate, this was actually somebody bombing a school versus bombing a military site. You have that cryptographic proof of that. Those are areas where those are incredible stories. When we think about ESG, I think we have, for too long, companies have sort of said, yep, we have these goals. We're going to try to meet them. There's been sort of this rah, we promise we're going to do this. And there's been no way for them to demonstrate it. And there's been no way for their customers to believe that. On the other side of it, there's also been no way for them to confirm that, hey, the carbon credits that I am purchasing because I have made this public ESG promise have not also been purchased by 3 other people. So I think that carbon and other marketplaces are a perfect example for the use of blockchain to bring that transparency and bring that accountability to ESG processes, whether that is the people who are selling those credits or the people who are purchasing those credits and trying to demonstrate that to the broader world. Now, we were not able to, we as an industry were not able to do this when everything was on a highly energy consumptive blockchain, right? That just doesn't work. It goes against the ethos of you can't say, great, here's my, beautiful supply chain that demonstrates I've purchased all these carbon credits and, they're being used. And by the way, I'm demonstrating that on a blockchain that is using more energy than whatever in your country. So UCL, which is actually another Hedera Governing Council member, has done some studies in terms of the energy consumption of various proof of stake networks. They set aside proof of work because proof of work is sort of like, we're not going to
no point.
But they have done some work in terms of the energy consumption of various proof of stake networks. They found that Hedera, you can actually do, I think it's about 70 transactions on the Hedera network before you use the same amount of energy as one swipe of your Visa card. So we go to the store, we don't think twice about how much one swipe of that card takes. The network uses a fraction of that. So if you're trying to build your carbon-based marketplaces, if you are trying to build these accountability platforms, that's really important.
That's huge. If we could move Visa on chain, which would be awesome, then right there, that would be huge environmental impact if they could have 1/70th on every transaction. Wow, that would be amazing. I read an article by your chief of staff, Nomini Rubin, I believe is her name. And she talked about, I don't know if you know this article or you know what she was speaking of, she talked about putting the balance sheet of the planet on a public ledger. What does that mean? Can you explain that?
Yeah, so Nomini Rubin is actually our head of global policy, and now she is just focused on global policy. But the concept is a ledger is really that, right? It is essentially a balance sheet. It shows sort of inputs, outputs. It shows how well we are doing in certain ways. And the accountability that is needed, right? If you have it sort of on a private ledger, somebody could manipulate it. Somebody could change the numbers. We've all seen, the instances of companies fudging numbers. When you put that on a public ledger, when you account for those emissions, when you account for, hey, if I am a farmer and I have promised that I am, going to use some of my land, for carbon credits, I need that accountability to be public, right? I need for Microsoft to be able to say, hey, I'm not buying those same carbon credits that Delta Airlines is buying, right? You don't have a double spend problem. So a public ledger allows you to put those on there. It also allows, Delta Airlines to say, great, I have purchased these carbon credits from these 5 sources, and I can prove that. I can also demonstrate to you the, reduction in emissions that I've done other ways, and I can similarly prove that. Across my supply chain, I can demonstrate for every one of my vendors how much they have done that. So, if you think about sort of what a balance sheet does, it is those debits and credits, right? If you make that public, there's a lot more accountability for both the people who are creating, carbon credits and other offsets, as well as the people who are managing that across their supply chains and demonstrating that to their end users.
Wouldn't that be amazing? If you want to dive deeper into this carbon credits on chain, recommend our listeners go back and listen to the episode with Climate DAO, because they really break down how challenging it is to achieve this mission because of the current system that is set up, and really there's not a lot of incentive for the current stakeholders to make this move. So go back and listen to that if you want to check that out. But love to hear that Hedera and UCL are focused on that. What was the other organization? Before we were talking about carbon credits, you mentioned another organization that was doing good in the public good space.
Oh, yes, Project Starling.
Project Starling. Okay, I want to make sure I include that link in the show notes. Project Starling, we'll get that from you.
This was started by a professor out of Stanford and USC. His name is Jonathan Doughton. USC has something called the Shoah Foundation, which Steven Spielberg actually started after he filmed Schindler's List. So, the genesis of this was really, how do we make sure to document what has happened in areas where there has been this tremendous strife and human suffering, so that we can't do things like, pretend the Holocaust didn't happen.
Wow, fascinating. I've never heard of that project. That's really interesting. Before we get to a speed round of a couple fun questions, anything else you want to share with our listeners? Anything you want to encourage them to do in terms of participating or joining the Hedera ecosystem? The floor is yours.
Yeah. So, a few things. Hedera is wide open to build on. If you want to, you can just go to hedera.com. You can set up a testnet account. You'll get some, sample HBARs to play around with as you build your application. If you are looking to engage, there is actually a very warm and welcoming Hedera community on Twitter, but also on, Reddit and Discord. If you are looking for support, there's an incredible developer advocacy team that helps people think about, how they are structuring their offerings and their products. We also have on that site a partial list of the hundreds of applications that are built on top of Hedera. So you can go learn more about those applications, how people are using them in areas like ESG, accountability, supply chain. So I would definitely encourage anyone who, has questions to go there. You can also reach out to us at Hedera or at Zenobia Zag on Twitter, and we'd love to hear questions. I think our job is to continue to just educate the market, make sure they know the ways that Hedera is different, make sure we correct misnomers that are out there in the market, and keep telling the story.
Thank you for doing that. We all need to do that if we're going to achieve our goals of growing and bringing everyone on chain. Okay, couple fun questions before we wrap up here. What is a must-read book that you find yourself recommending to people more?
Oh my gosh. Let's see. So many. One that I will share for this group is called Making Numbers Count. It is a way to think about describing things to people so that they matter, right? Humans are actually very bad at math. Not bad at math, but we're very bad at imagining the differences in terms of scope and size, right? So if I were to tell you that, Hedera is 10,000 times more energy efficient than blockchain X, that doesn't mean a lot, right? But if I were to tell you that you can do 80 transactions on the Hedera network before you use as much energy as one swipe of your Visa card, it makes it much more tangible and it makes it much more easy to understand. I think it has some great examples in that book of, when you were talking about social distancing and people having to be 6 feet apart. I think it might have been in Canada that they were like, look, that is 2 hockey sticks apart, right?
It's true.
In Russia, it might have been it is 1 grizzly bear apart, right? You put things into stories so that people can visualize them. And so I think if you are in this space and you are trying to get across concepts, because it is such a technical space, because we deal with numbers so much, that book is a great read for anybody who is trying to convey important concepts that have any kind of numbers or math involved.
Wonderful. That is a really good suggestion. Okay, next question. One thing you've bought recently for under $100 that brings you joy. Does not have to be a digital product.
It's so funny because my sons will consume digital products all day long and they are obsessed with it. And so I watch them and I say, okay, this is really the future. But one of the things that I have bought recently, and I actually have it here with me, is a Keep cup. And it is Australia. It is a coffee cup that holds its promise. It actually keeps my coffee warm or my tea, which I drink all day, warm, no matter where I am. People are like, you're so obsessed with this cup. It's very bizarre. But it actually works. It doesn't make a mess, spills.
Wonderful. Well, I've got to ask, what are your kids spending? Is it Robux? Is that what they're spending their digital dollars on?
Robux. They will buy things in like whatever the baseball game is. You can buy, and they have these very vivid characters, right? Where you can buy, additional points for this character or additional skills for this character.
It's all gaming, right?
Yeah. It's all gaming.
Gaming is the industry that still does not make sense why it's not on chain to me. Like it's so obvious, but for some reason gamers hate NFTs. Maybe not your age kids, but I feel like the 20-year-old gamers all hate NFTs anyway.
Well, I think it's the way it's been, delivered to them, right? If you deliver it to them as an in-game experience and a benefit to them, that changes the conversation.
Yeah, well, it's been delivered as an NFT, which to them, an NFT is a monkey JPEG that is made worth $100,000 for no reason. So they don't like what they don't understand. It makes sense. Don't call it an NFT. I mean, you talked about that. It's so important to abstract the tech away and make it simple. Anyways, I'm opening up a rabbit hole. Let's not go down there. Last question. If you had a billboard that 1 billion people were going to see, what would you write on it?
Oh gosh. Be kind.
Wow, this is the most common thing that people say. This is amazing. This gives me so much hope in humanity. Last week's guest said be kind as well.
Oh, wow.
And I can tell you, we have asked this question on over 100 interviews, and be kind is the most common answer. Doesn't that feel so good? That's wonderful.
It does. It feels great. We need more of it in the world, but I was listening to a podcast. I don't know if you've heard of Andrew Huberman. So he was talking about if you can't be kind just for selfless reasons, then please be kind for selfish reasons, because civility and politeness and kindness in your actions gets you so much further than not doing those things.
Great perspective. Great perspective. And we can talk about Huberman's podcast because he's not competition to our podcast. Everyone go listen to Huberman Labs and his podcast. It's wonderful. It'll teach you all about how to live a happier, healthier life, which we definitely support that. Zenobia, this has been an absolute joy. Thank you so much for the time. Thank you to the whole Hedera team for everything you're building in the ecosystem, for experimenting, for being here so early, and for not being afraid to make mistakes. We need more leaders like that.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening in, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to Web3 Academy, your one trusted source to capitalize on the next big phase of the internet. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it and subscribe or follow so that you don't miss the next one. While you're at it, there's a link in the description for our free newsletter where we provide timely and relevant Web3 insights so you can confidently build and invest in Web3. Make sure to subscribe today. One final note. This podcast is for educational purposes only, and nothing we say is financial advice. Crypto and Web3 are risky, and you should never invest more than you're willing to lose. Thank you, friends, and see you in the next one.